Stefan, are you on the line?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that.
No worries.
Perfect. Okay, so I guess I'll just dive right in. Aubry, maybe if I'm running a little bit behind my minutes because of the late start, maybe you could just give me like maybe a 2-3 minute notice, so I'll be able to wrap up.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so my name is Stefan Majumdar, and the name of my talk today is When the Curtain Falls, Selfhood, Identity, and Self-Worth When Psychological Infrastructures Collapse. Since the late modern age, many philosophers and psychologists have endorsed an exclusively empirical experiential interpretation of human mind and identity as self-evident. Previous to this, individual human identity and interpretations of selfhood were, to different degrees, under various religious and philosophical systems, viewed as objectively determined and realized. The advent of the 20th century saw the emergence of investigative traditions that follow from specific paradigmatic shifts away from idealism that has import for contemporary psychology. Phenomenology, often associated with figures such as Armand Husserl, Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Martin Heidegger, and hermeneutics, often viewed through the works of Wilhelm Dilthey, Hans-Urs Gadamer, and Paul Ricoeur, for example, are two such traditions. Phenomenology places special emphasis on essential aspects of subjective experience in the world, while hermeneutics is primarily concerned with the study of interpretation and meaning. Another landmark scientific development towards the beginning of the 20th century was psychoanalysis. Perhaps most notable amongst those in the development of the school were Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Jacques Lacan. The general focus of psychoanalysis is the careful study and analysis of subjective experience and the development of the subject according to the interpretive contours of each respective subsystem. The hermeneutic phenomenology and psychoanalysis we are considering today view the subject as ontologically situated within the trajectory of her own experience. Nothing is conferred at the advent of conscious awareness, with the exception of the world as it presents and imposes itself. Her consciousness and identity will be, as it were, radically hers alone. And it is for that reason that she herself is responsible for it. It is in the instance that the contingent existential and psychological infrastructures which give rise to and maintain her identity unceremoniously collapse, that she must contend with the anxiety that arises from this fundamental rupture. Lacan, object A, and psychological infrastructure. Lacan's psychoanalytic program views the human infant as an assemblage of unmitigated drives, and to an extent, satisfaction of those drives. The French jouissance represents, at least in a rudimentary sense, the purest form of the child's engagement with his mother in deriving the satisfaction he seeks in an unbridled fashion. As Lacan 1973 points out, this point is essential for when we examine it more closely, we shall see that the Triebreiz, or drive, is that by which certain elements of this field are, says Freud, Triebbesetzt, invested as drive. This investment places us on the terrain of an energy, and not any energy, a potential energy. For Freud, articulated in the most pressing way, the characteristic of the drive is to be a constant drive, or a constant force. The child confronts admonition by the father for the child's unrestrained drive, preoccupations and attachment to the mother, and experiences an outcome of that imposition, a primordial sense of restriction or lack. He now experiences the absence of unrestrained jouissance that he retro-interpretively mistakes for having been complete or a state of unmitigated satisfaction. The absence of this imaginary past is now a protraction. Lacan 1997 explains further that if we now try to conceive of a circumstance of the subjective position in which, to the appeal of the name of the father, responds, not the absence of the real father, the presence of the signifier in the other is, in effect, a presence usually closed to the subject because it usually persists in a state of repression. And because from there it insists on representing itself in the signified by means of a repetition compulsion. End quote. The child is forever cast from an ideal world that never was, but now wants to return to. Object A represents an other that is simultaneously intractably incorporated with the psychic being of the subject. It is not a psychological object with its own epistemic boundaries per se, but rather a phenomenal valence between something the child now lacks and is. As Lacan 1990 explains, I have gone so far as to punctuate the function of petit a at the level of the scotopic drive. Its essence is realized insofar as, more than elsewhere, the subject is captive of the function of desire. Object A emerges in the subject's inaccurate retrospective interpretation of pre-socialized jouissance to eventually become desire. Object A does not itself inhere contents, although it bears the traces of unconscious shadows of psychologically primordial experiences, which give contour to the specificity of objects of desire in articulated psychological life. Lacan 1973 states that it is insofar as the drive is evidence of the forcing of the pleasure principle that it provides with us evidence that beyond the real I, another reality intervenes, and we shall see by what return it is this other reality, in the last resort, that has given this real I its structure and diversification. End quote. Master signifiers represent the idiosyncratic foundation of desire and set the framework inside which identity will assume its particular series of ongoing accomplishments and psychological aggregates. Pardon me. As noted, object A is not a reference to a psychological object per se, but rather an object cause, Lacan 1973. To make this notion clear, imagine a child fantasizing about being able to fly. The place or role of object A in this particular fantasy is not the image in the subject's mind of taking flight, but rather the sheer impossibility of this act. It is the distal sphere of ever-present and prescient lack, both towards and from which the subject seeks reunion with an imagined past. The subject moves through the world beset with a lexicon of values and hierarchies of worth, which are prior to her critical examination of the accidental nature of their assemblage for this reason. The effects of this object cause are essential in her interpretation of herself, those she identifies with, compares herself to, and the outcomes of her practical accomplishment or lack thereof in the midst of these. As Lacan explains, 1973, one lack is superimposed on the other. The dialectics of the objects of desire, insofar as it creates the link between the desire of the subject and the desire of the other, is one and the same. This dialectic now passes through the fact that the desire is not replied to directly. It is a lack engendered from the previous time that serves to reply to the lack raised by the following time, end quote. The outcome of these psychologically imminent assessments, which it is not unreasonable to assume are relatively constant, are both reinforcing and concretizing the artifacts of the identity structure that follows from the processes we've thus far been discussing. Also, the subject's conceptualizing of her personal worth is derived in the cultural framework where those desires have been continuously deployed, refined, and recast in our interactions. She is psychomotively tethered to a universe of contingencies that emit from a phantom desire. The subject's orientation in the complex of the social world she navigates is the assemblage of the form her drives and desires will assume. The institutional contingencies embodied by the society she happens to live in are secondary to those desires, inasmuch as they serve to support, enable, and reinforce their aims. Education, as provided by the state, permits, at the most fundamental level, the ability of the subject to refine and fix the basic elements of mental life required for functioning within economics broadly defined, or economies broadly defined. Healthcare similarly provides the fundamental of physical safety and longevity, as is the case for food supply chains, the maintenance of physical infrastructures of built environments, and the ability to communicate freely with ease, for example. Each necessary pillar of society in which a person has found continuity, inside which desire postulates the constituents of its ongoing aims, is needed to conceal its essentially contingent nature. Without them, the identity that is forged in this constellation is forced to confront itself. The developing subject encounters the social and institutional world confronted with the desire of others, each according to their own complexes. In the interaction of competing desires, the subject finds the complexity of the ongoing redirection and augmentation of it. Describing the function of object A, Lacan 1990 tells us that here it takes on its function as support of desire, insofar as desire is the most intense of what the subject can attain in his realization as subject at the level of consciousness. It is by way of that chain that, once again, the dependencies of desire in relation to the desire of the other are affirmed, end quote. From the moment of its introduction, the social world outside of the family unit is saturated with comparison, competitiveness, and the variously determined hierarchies of worth and value and so forth. As the subject navigates into higher degrees of psychological and social complexity, these realities only become more protracted, leaving their indelible mark on her sense of self. Pardon me. Added to this picture of the developing self is the amplification of these social realities in our increasingly digitized and therefore public lives. Identity and selfhood has in significant ways been externalized and recast as an assembly of credential objects of various sorts in the ever-growing and influential domains of social media, for example. These are ostensibly reabsorbed into the sphere of self-conscious identification. The remains of marketing, advertising, near ubiquitous possession of sophisticated computing devices in most industrialized societies presents opportunities for drive and desire manipulation that is unprecedented. Modern data science and near instantaneous statistical analysis, unimaginable only a few years ago, bear implications for identity formation that is difficult to yet fully comprehend. What is clear for the purposes of our discussion is that the increasing technologizing of virtually every aspect of modern life has largely objectified identity. And we have recast ourselves in important ways as the object we desire. In the Lacanian sense, forms of digital technology have led to the fetishizing of aspects of our projected selves that are then reabsorbed as authentic composites of identity. In this distillation, identity has emerged in the marketplace of desire that requires arguably more than anything, the reliability of the material conditions that gave rise to it. Much of contemporary motivation in the industrialized world aims at material acquisition and commanding prestige in various ways. Apart from the fetishizing of those objects as signifiers in themselves, what does the subject achieve in getting what she desires? According to Lacan, object petit a does not point towards a desire that could be fulfilled, satisfied, or exhausted. Lacan, 1973, tells us that object A, cause of desire, we must give it a function that will explain its place in the satisfaction of the drive. That la pulsion fait le tour. Tour is to be understood here with ambiguity. It possesses, the ambiguity possesses in French. Both turn, the limit around which one turns, and trick, end quote. Object A represents the lack that signifies an impossible termination because its origins are a fiction, an idealized absence that fell into the world of language. Selves that are manufactured in the machinery of economies where our minds are disseminated and then regained in the form of the anterior of other people's desires, through things like competitiveness, envy, greed, and so forth, will seek out satisfaction where it has been promised. But the upward trajectory of laudatory accomplishment and consumptive acts always fail to exhaust desire. From attaining one of these seen in anticipation as the height of desire follows another, as dissatisfaction is the ever-present shadow to its blinding light. This resonates with Brickman and Campbell's 1971 development of the hedonic treadmill heuristic developed in their essay, Hedonic Relativism in the Planning in the Good Society, in which they describe the cyclical pattern of achievement or acquisition and subsequent dissatisfaction leading to further motivation for more of what was originally sought. This implies for the identity forged in the cyclical trajectory of desire, disappointment and subsequent desiring comes unhinged when the seemingly indestructible cultural and economic complexes that created and enabled it falter. The stark demonstration of the sheer fragility of those societal pillars. Indeed, the subject's life itself and the awareness of the indiscriminate and virulent nature of a pandemic will throw into question the sense of selfhood that had been so arduously constructed in its agonistic relations to labor, other people, and ongoing desire. Ensuing could be feelings of emptiness, dread, meaninglessness, and foreboding. In these many ways, the material bedrock of agentive desire has come unlodged, and with it, the psychological objects scaffolding identity that had deployed and maintained it in the world. Sartre, Bad Faith, Choice, and Identity. Jean-Paul Sartre, the 20th century phenomenological existentialist philosopher, is well known for his propositions surrounding radical freedom and radical responsibility. His now nominal text, Being and Nothingness, 1956, he elucidated the ontological conditions of consciousness relative to being, such that the former was shown as groundless or independent of hypothetical prior facts of being. Sartre writes that man does not exist first in order to be free. Subsequently, there is no difference between the being of man and his being free. This implies, amongst other things, that the subject was not tethered to any moral, ethical, or cultural system in an ontological way. The subject's conscious orientation in the world was one of a necessary freedom to determine one's orientation and action in the world. Sartre's work contains a treatment of what we can think of as a form of self-delusion, or what he calls bad faith in making decisions about how we think about ourselves and act in the world. It would, however, be imprecise to characterize Sartre's use of the term bad faith as a form of simple self-deception. Sartre conceptualizes bad faith as a phenomenal condition of consciousness, not simply a series of straightforward lies. As Sartre in 1956 explains, we shall willingly grant that bad faith is a lie to oneself on condition that we distinguish the lie to oneself from lying in general. But this negation does not bear on consciousness itself. It aims only at the transcendent. The essence of the lie lies in the fact that the liar is in complete possession of the truth which he is hiding. The importance of this statement rests in the assertion that human beings cannot directly apprehend bad faith, which is instead something that must remain hidden from the self in order to exist, as straightforward self-deception would otherwise be too transparent. However, Sartre in 1956 elaborates that there must be an original intention of a project of bad faith. This project implies a comprehension of bad faith as such, and a pre-reflective apprehension of consciousness as affecting itself with bad faith, end quote. Sartre in 1956 further elaborates that, let us understand clearly that there is no question of a reflexive voluntary decision, but of a spontaneous determination of our being. One puts oneself in bad faith as one goes to sleep, and one is in bad faith as one dreams, end quote. The essential phenomenal distinction within the activity of bad faith is one between facticity and transcendence. So beginning quote, the basic concept is thus engendered, utilizes the double property of the human being. He who is at once a facticity and a transcendence, bad faith does not wish either to coordinate them or to surmount them in a synthesis. Bad faith seeks to affirm their identity while preserving their differences, end quote. Sartre claims that human consciousness entails both a consciousness of facticity or contingent transience of the contents of the world, the consciousness of intentional objects, in other words, and the freedom to transcend those facts in navigating the world. Sartre's now famous example of a waiter at a cafe is useful in demonstrating the practical meaning of this dynamic. Excuse me. The waiter is depicted as moving about with a seeming excess of deliberation and exaggeration of uniform expressions and posturing. Sartre in 1956 describes the waiter's display as almost automaton-like. The waiter is engaged in a type of productive performance of the facticity of being a waiter. Not only this, as Sartre in 1956 explains, the waiter in the cafe plays with his condition in order to realize it, end quote. What is underscored here is the subsuming of the waiter's identity in the domain of facticity and his unwillingness to acknowledge the possibility of transcendence. One practical way of interpreting this example is to note that one is not what one does. Sartre in 1956 reinforces this notion when he states of performing one's occupation that this obligation is not different from that which is imposed on all tradesmen. Their condition is wholly one of ceremony. The public demands of them that they realize it as a ceremony, end quote. More accurate way of saying this, however, is that one is not what one does. That one is what one is not. Sartre in 1956, commenting on this issue, claims that I am a waiter in the mode of being what I am not. This is to say that individual consciousness is always free in transcendence, so one's being is always independent of what one does. This is also a way of saying that I am this, a waiter, by virtue of the fact that I am not that, an engineer, as neither designation corresponds with being in itself. We can conceptualize bad faith as a refusal to accept the radical freedom conferred by transcendence in existence that is immersed in facticity. One's occupation, concept of statehood, economic standing, even the facts of one's personal history are aspects of facticity. For as Sartre 1956 states, I am never any one of my attitudes, any one of my actions. It is in this sense that Sartre's subject is radically free from the contingencies that bind identity in their forward march through the complexities of the social, economic, and psychological conditions that gave rise to them to begin. Naturally, when circumstances such as currently beset the world upends those infrastructures, the subject who has lost a long-held job, perhaps a system of belief, or supreme confidence in the nation state, for example, will respond with varying degrees of distress. An approach to this dilemma that utilizes Sartre's conceptualizations, as described here then, may be to engage the subject in an examination of the facticity of those aspects of their lives that appear threatened or have disappeared in relation to the fact of their being. In practical terms, one might attempt to make the subject's transcendence in the complex of the subject's particular identity organization apparent to her, to make evident that she isn't essentially any or all of these intentional objects. In the wake of what had collapsed, she can now see the facticity in identity for what it is, and freely choose who she will be as a result. This process may indeed be terrifying, but the fear produced in losing the bearings of one's identity is arguably a necessary moment in liberating and actualizing one's self-concept. Excuse me. Aubry, how am I doing for time?
I think you have about 6-7 minutes or so.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Lacan, Love and Psyche. Lacan, 1972, once provocatively claimed for it to be announced as truth that there is no sexual relationship. The meaning of this quote rests in an elaboration of Lacan's system of the constellation of master signifiers, jouissance and object to describe and differentiate between sexuality and the nature of authentic relationships. In this analysis, Lacan came to assert that all sexual attraction was, to one extent or another, an elaborated function of personally potent signifiers that produce through jouissance and object a series of characteristics that the object of sexual desire reflected back to the subject in possessing them. In the specific sense of the arousal-producing qualities represented in the object of sexual desire, the subject had come to fetishize those qualities. Subsequently, the personhood of the other had been negated in the narcissistic importance of the desired qualities, effectively casting the phenomenal nature of the interaction between two people as largely self-referential engagement. Lacan's provision in this dynamic was that each subject could genuinely come to love the other in as authentic a way as possible, as Lacan 1972 explains. So then, of course, this explains that the enjoyment of the body of the other for its part is not a necessary response. This even goes further. It is not a sufficient response either, because love for its part demands love. It does not cease to demand it, it still demands it. The subject, end quote, the subject could only truly connect with the personhood of another or form an authentic relationship once the edifice of fetishes had been properly identified and genuine love for the person behind them was established. Lacan 1973 goes on to say, this is why he must get himself out. And in the getting himself out, in the end, he will know that the real other has just as much as himself to get himself out, to pull himself free. It is here that the need for good faith becomes imperative. A good faith based on the certainty that the same implications of difficulty in relation to the ways of desire is also in the other. If we individuate this dynamic, it could be argued that the self has developed and identified himself with those contingent aspects of selfhood embedded in the infrastructures he is situated in. In this sense, the individual has come to develop an identification with this concept that itself represents a catalog of fetishes. The subject has accumulated in the form of identity psychic accomplishments which have their correlates in the positioning between desire and the contingencies we've discussed. He had, in effect, developed his sense of worth or lack thereof within his normative identity in interactions with the world, which may be endangered or no longer matter altogether. This bottoming out of selfhood, as it were, could, among other outcomes, be regarded as a profoundly alienating experience. One comes to feel alienated from oneself in the process of the dismantling of the networks of desire. But it is precisely in this distress, the anxiety produced in the dislodging of one's desire from its networks, that ground is cleared for the subject to engage in genuine self-regard or love. In the structures which held the objects within the subject's identity in place collapse, she is given the opportunity to dismantle them and love herself unconditionally in their place. And that's it. So, yeah, I mean, it's largely, you know, I was largely just going by the letter of the page there, so I don't have a lot of improvisation beyond that. I've seen a lot of sort of stream of consciousness stuff happening with other talks, but yeah, that's, I mean, how are we looking for time, Aubry?
I think we'll go ahead and present, and then we will reserve the last 10 minutes of the panel approximately for questions for both of us, right?
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks.
So welcome, attendees. I just wanted to get us started here today. I'm going to be sharing my screen. I have a presentation that our team has created. Just one moment. In here you can see one of the things that I will do to start us off is just to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Aubry Threlkeld, and I'm the Associate Dean of Graduate Education at Endicott College. My scholarly interests include broadly critical psychology, but also cultural studies, and in particular disability studies. Some of my work most recently concerns itself with mental health and higher education, which is what has found me here today.
Great. I'm Dr. Sarah McMahon. I'm an assistant professor and program director at Endicott College, along with Aubry. My areas of focus tend to be higher education, education policy, and online learning.
And my name is Maureen McLaughlin. I am a first-year doctoral student, of which I've been grateful to be mentored by Dr. McMahon and Dr. Threlkeld. And while also being a student, I'm a special needs teacher in an elementary school setting in Massachusetts. I'm the mother of 7 young adult children and who are either attending or have attended college. So I'm familiar with higher education as a parent as well. And then lastly, I would like to share that this is my first conference that I've ever attended, and I'm happy to be here with you all and grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you. The title of our talk today is Who is in Charge of Self-Care During a Pandemic? Themes and Tweets by Community Colleges in Washington State. We're opening up with a few quotes to describe our approach, which I think builds on the general critical nature of Stefan's presentation, but with a more focus. In self-care, we're not pursuing the broad ethics of care of the self, but actually looking more at what colleges and universities are doing or saying they're doing to support students during this crisis. I can't help but think about the two framing quotes here by Wendy Brown and Svetkovich, both of whom are critical in their own right. Wendy Brown, as a political theorist, critical of the role that democracies, particularly neoliberal states, have played in downplaying, defunding, and through general austerity measures, causing colleges that were once perhaps the greatest accomplishment of American public education in the 20th century, certainly undoing some of that work, which leads to a vibrant democratic life, while also acknowledging that context of a vibrant democratic life doesn't exist solely at the level of the institution, but instead that we also have to concern ourselves with the lived experiences and affective experiences of the individuals who are parts of those institutions, who comprise those institutions. And it is within this binary that, and this granularity, that we move throughout this presentation. We are primarily centered on the concerns of universities and colleges as displayed in their tweets, but we are interested deeply in the reception of those tweets by individuals. And now I turn it over to my colleague, Sarah McMahon.
Thank you, Aubry. As Aubry said, as the COVID-19 pandemic began unfolding here in the United States, it started in Washington State and spread from there. We watched as colleges and universities began to react and respond in myriad ways. And we, Aubry, Maureen, and I were really interested in how higher education institutions were responding to the crisis, and how their response, or lack thereof, was contributing to other underlying crises and impacting students. With students, and we wanted to see how they were responding to students, again, via their social media channels, and how they were attending to or inadvertently contributing to the ongoing mental health crisis that is here in that is plaguing, the US higher education system. So before the pandemic hit, higher education in the US was grappling with a mental health crisis, one that has been worsening year after year. According to the American College Health Association, which conducts an annual survey of college students and asks them about their general well-being, in 2019, they found that 76% of students reported feeling overwhelmed by expectations, 62% experienced overwhelming anxiety, 45% felt too depressed to function, and 13% had seriously contemplated suicide. And that's just within the last year. These serious ailments have serious ramifications if they're left unaddressed. For example, mental health disorders are associated with a range of negative educational outcomes, from lower grades to delayed graduation to dropping out of school altogether. And these negative educational outcomes can have repercussions through the remainder of a student's life, impacting their long-term mental health and their lifetime earnings. Even more concerning, students indicate the mental health crisis is especially acute at community colleges. And that's due to a number of factors. The first is demographic differences. For example, community college students tend to be older. Some of them have families. Many of them are working part, if not full-time, while attending school. And because of that, they generally don't live on campus, and they're more likely to be enrolled on a part-time basis. Because of that, community college students are on campus less frequently. So there are fewer opportunities to interact for faculty and staff to pick up on signs of mental distress or identify students who may be at risk for developing some sort of, who may be grappling with a mental health crisis, an impending mental health crisis, and they're unable to get them the support they need. The majority of community college students also tend to belong to minority groups and come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Because of that, many of them are also dealing with issues such as discrimination, housing instability, food insecurity, financial instability, and they're dealing with all of these factors while they're also trying to juggle their coursework. This increased pressure leaves community college students especially vulnerable to mental health issues. And finally, studies have shown that students who have dealt with documented mental health issues in the past are much more prone to enroll in a community college than a four-year college. So on top of having these factors that already exacerbated, the community colleges have an outsized population of students who are dealing with mental health crises. So as a result, this mental health crisis has become especially acute at community colleges. Despite the prevalence of mental health issues on college campuses, researchers have found that only 10 to 15% of the students who meet the criteria for a mental health disorder actually seek help at a counseling center. And this could be due to a number of barriers, one of which is lack of awareness. This could include students not recognizing the symptoms of their particular, of a mental health crisis, preferring to handle the problem on their own, or general lack of knowledge about the available mental health services. Another issue or barrier could be student perceptions. Some students are afraid that if they seek help for a mental health issue, that it will negatively impact either their academic record or their prospective employment options. Some of them, there are also misperceptions about costs. Students are afraid that it will cost, it will be expensive, so then they don't pursue those avenues. And most concerning is lack of availability. As Aubry mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, nearly all community colleges have had to contend with decreasing levels of state funding over the past 15 years. As a result, they've had to do a lot more with a lot less support, and they've had to do this year over year. Unfortunately, mental health clinics have been one of the areas that tend to be either outsourced or cut first. And in 2016, a national study found that 88% of community colleges didn't have a psychiatrist on staff or contracted with one to provide services to their campus. And when community colleges do have mental health counselors on staff, these individuals tend to perform other functions such as career counseling, academic advising, committee work. They're pulled in several different directions. In compounding matters, most mental health counseling is only provided weekdays between 8 to 5 p.m., with only 16% providing on-call or after-hours emergency coverage. So lack of availability is an understatement. And that's not surprising when you look at how higher education deals with crisis management in general. It's definitely an area that is lacking. The research is nascent. Crisis management is a relatively young field, only dating back to the 1980s, and its application to higher education is even more recent, starting in the early 2000s. And the literature is also limited in scope. The existing crisis management research tends to focus on discrete campus-based events, such as an active shooter or a fire, rather than prolonged crises like the one we're seeing now, or the mental health crisis we were just talking about. And there's also a paucity of research when it comes to community colleges. The majority of crisis management research focuses on residential four-year campuses, and it doesn't account for the geographic, demographic, financial, and organizational differences between four-year residential institutions and community colleges. As a result, many of the findings and recommendations are limited, if not moot, leaving community colleges with little constructive guidance when it comes to crisis management. So as a result, the actual crisis management in higher education is lacking, and it's lacking in a number of dimensions. There's a lack of adequate planning. A survey of provosts at 350 major US colleges and universities revealed that the majority of respondents reported that their institution was generally prepared for a crisis, but only for crises that they had already experienced. Another institution found that although institutions had written crisis plans, they rarely addressed situations falling outside the traditional crises parameters, again, such as fire, crime, lawsuits, and failed to address incidents such as suicides, terrorist attacks, campus shootings, administrative scandals, hazing, or issues related to racial discrimination, all things that have occurred with increasing frequency over the past decade. There's also a lack of adequate staffing. Researchers have found that colleges aren't practiced or confident in their ability to execute on plans, and that is largely because they don't have the broad-based crisis management teams with members drawn from multiple departments, constituencies, and technical areas. Instead, they most often rely on ad hoc emergency response teams And as a result, studies have found that many administrators are unsure of what exactly they're supposed to do in a crisis. Finally, there's a lack of adequate scoping. As mentioned earlier, crisis plans tend to focus on discrete, acute events, and senior administrators have failed to address the perpetual and chronic crises, sexual assault, alcohol abuse, mental health, in any sort of systemic way. Any attempts to address these issues have been fragmented and fail to address the cultural preconditions that fuel these ongoing crises. This behavior is only exacerbated at community colleges who are under-supported and under-resourced to the extent that they're only able to provide logistical support in moments of crises. In fact, colleges and universities tend to inadvertently create their own crises, say through corporate investment or donor relations, for example. So that's all to say, in this study, we wanted to focus on not only how colleges respond to crises, but how their response or lack thereof contributes to ongoing crises, such as the mental health epidemic. And this leads to our research questions. With themes emerging in Washington, what themes emerge in Washington State Community College tweets during the coronavirus 19 pandemic? How do these themes relate to students themselves, supports, and self-care? And to what extent does the data indicate a need for more trauma-informed or even mad approaches to self-care?
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. So with that, we chose to take a look at social media, particularly Twitter, and the way in which colleges or community colleges tweeted out information to their communities, particularly their students or other constituents. We chose to look at community colleges in Washington State and a time frame which was sort of the tipping point, if you will, of the COVID crisis, beginning in February 15th of 2020. And we looked at the tweets through that time frame to May 5th. And we were able to garner tweets from 31 colleges. And this came to just a little bit over 350 tweets that we were able to analyze for this pilot study. On average, these colleges would tweet around 11 or so times out to the constituents through Twitter. And the amount of tweets ranged from one community college had just one tweet over this time frame, all the way up to some colleges tweeting up to somewhere around 20, 22 times during this time frame. And so for our method of analysis, we chose a thematic approach where we coded tweets word by word. And we used some guiding questions while doing this analysis. For example, why might this information be ones that are tweeted by these colleges? What might be the goal of the community college in this tweet? Who is intended to receive this tweet? And then sort of underneath that is who is not. Okay. And so we were able to work together in a few workshops as a team to collaborate and discuss our coding and develop these themes that emerged through the data. The first being the resources or the student supports that the community colleges were sharing out with the students and constituents. The second being attempts to engage the community. Third being sort of an announcement of accomplishments or accolades, if you will. And the last theme that we identified were alerts or logistics, different matters of communication to the student body. So I'm going to proceed through each theme with some characteristics that we identified, and then we'll proceed forward with the some examples that we pulled from these tweets. So in this first theme of resources or student supports, we noticed the focus on this personal care, if you will, but more of a physical nature, hygiene, also leading back to this demographic, which tend to be experiencing food insecurity or housing insecurity. So there was information that was communicated in those aspects. Some of these tweets also pointed to technical help as these community colleges moved to online or remote teaching for their students. And then on occasion, you would see information being shared for resources for emotional care, such as stress reduction or ways to communicate with other members of the staff. And so some examples, if you will, are, here's this first one, which talks about a self-care workshop. But if you see, it centers around preparing for finals, not necessarily what's going on elsewhere. There is laptops that are being distributed. There is a counselor is available for managing stress as you stay at home, and the importance of finding joy if you're able to, and how someone might go about doing that, and how you can spread it and share it with your community. And this last one I think is interesting to point out that on May 4th, it's time to plan ahead. So despite the uncertainty as to what's happening in the future, there's an attempt to say that life may go on as usual, and explore the opportunities to advance your career and prepare for the future. Okay, and as we move into theme 2, community engagement, again, there were ways in which to stay connected to members of the community, the community college community, if you will, and also to have the student body engage outside of the college in various ways as well. And it was interesting to see the colleges use questions to grab the attention or to draw in students, if you will, that may find themselves in those questions, and therefore seek answers to those questions by engaging with the community college. Okay, and the some examples, if you will, are, you can see they're reaching out to prospective students, wanting to know if they are interested in gaining information and engaging with an admissions coach, and that would happen over Zoom. Questions about online learning. There's resources on the learning management system known as Canvas for the students to engage. There's ways in which for students to share their story, looking ahead to graduation and perhaps even wanting to be a graduation speaker. And then this, last tweet points to, the sort of the extreme or the severity in which some community college students may be experiencing the hardship of being laid off, or are you eligible for federal food benefits, assuming that they know, or low income, do you need help with paying for tuition, and inviting them to visit a website to see if they qualify. And that was even as late as May 4th. Okay, so we move on to theme 3, which is the accomplishments and the accolades. Sharing various stakeholders, whether it be students, faculty, or athletics, sort of in various milestones that they had made, accomplishments, awards, even conference sports titles, if you will. And then the examples, again, there was a president who accepted a position during this time frame early on in February, using some terminology that may resonate with the student body. Let's give it up for nursing students and healthcare workers that are supporting the efforts and taking care of people during the pandemic. Congratulations for academic achievements. Way to go, Bulldogs. And also to the faculty and staff who've been able to get one of their degree programs through the accreditation process and earning accreditation. And again, these vary from February all the way through April as well. And okay, and then the last one, the alerts and logistics. These tweets were pointing students and community members to various resources within the college, but also, you know, across platforms and resources outside of the community college, mainly to authorities. These definitely had a different tone, if you will, or way of messaging. They were declarative statements, they were directive statements to either take action or not take action. But it had us sort of pause for a bit and wonder the recipient's feelings around some of these alerts and the logistics. Sort of why was this happening? What was next? And what it might mean to me, if you will. So various organizations that were highlighted in these tweets were the World Health Organization as to certain hygiene that you should be sticking by, you should stay at home, that their community colleges are moving to online or remote teaching. There's an alert saying that there's going to be remote operations and you can learn more, at and directing them towards another website, stay at home. But then there's going to be some mandatory online training and that if you need a laptop, sort of quickly come and get a laptop, and it's on a first come, first serve basis for this mandatory type of training. And okay, that moves us to the results and implications for future study.
So one of the things that set us out on this journey was trying to understand how colleges and universities might be responding to this crisis. And while we did not aim to be summative in nature, we certainly aimed to answer the question about how they were providing resources. One way in which they may do that would be through social media. And taken together, these themes produce a picture of a community college on the verge of addressing some of these concerns while desperately trying to continue business as usual. The precise emphasis on business suggests this disjuncture between student needs and daily life and the daily life of a community college. You know, I'm not sure I would be, if I'm worried about housing security or food scarcity, be necessarily encouraged by the triumphs of our tennis team, for instance. Those kinds of concerns seemed very disjointed from the lived experiences many students may have had at this time, which gives us an opportunity to pose other types of response. You know, while this was a thematic analysis that veered toward a social constructivist approach, we also fully understood that by reading these, we discovered some of the discursive moves that were present in the texts, including the potential for understanding how the colleges were positioning subject pronouns like we to create authority and disseminate information in short declarative ways. And the we isn't necessarily, it is fixed onto the subjectivities of the individuals engaged with the work, not necessarily one that they themselves might claim. And it was really interesting to think about how in an environment where there is a lack of resources and this double set of needs, both around mental health and around a pandemic, so few responses overall, at least in this data set, which caused us to ask some questions about what could we do? What were other ways in which we might be able to engage people? I will first summarize a MAT-informed approach, and then I'll turn it to my colleague, Maureen McLaughlin, to summarize a trauma-informed approach. But I think it's important to ask the question, is there something we might have been able to learn from people who were particularly good at isolation? I'm thinking back to Anne Kvetovich's quote at the beginning where she described depression as a public feeling, how depression is something that can bring people together, perhaps in smaller groups, but actually becomes a way of understanding and seeing and experiencing the world. Similarly, some of our students who for a long time may have been struggling with their own mental health crises or mental disabilities or identities around those things may have been incredible resources to the rest of us who may have been placed in isolation without any kind of without as extensive experience or as recent of an experience. And so I think part of it is who is engaged and how. I turn it to Maureen.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, I think that brings up the fact that, you know, the population at community colleges have been under stress and adversity for quite some time. This is not something new to them, but now, as you were saying, it additive is the consequences of this pandemic. And with most of them being at least 40% or more working full time, and you know, the threats of unemployment and the hardships that are around that, you know, really amplify the struggles. And so turning to a trauma-informed and resilient approach, and I think those two words are really important to pair here, that it's not just about the trauma, but it's also about the resiliency that we can garner from a community who has been through adversity for quite some time, but also the systems that are in place that could be transformed to offer a more community involved and incorporated approach. So I'll quickly go through these 4 bullets, and it's really important to understand trauma, adversity, and toxic stress in terms of its prevalence and how it affects our bodies, our physiology, and thus our relationships, our reactions, our responses individually, but also collectively. We learn through connection. It's very important to understand how this connection can be disrupted in times of or toxic stress and the way we deal with toxic stress. Cultural humility, respect, and equity. You know, we each handle, and from our own cultural positions or traditions, we handle respond to trauma differently. And it is very important for an approach, a trauma-informed and resilient approach, to be aware of these differences, respectful of these differences, and to respond with sensitivity that may also involve patience. Let's see, thirdly, safety, stability, and compassion. And this gets to consistency. You know, meeting core basic human needs of hunger and shelter are critical for learning, and those should be prioritized. And then it is in those safe spaces where opportunities for connection, increased stability in daily life, and focus on wellness can start to build. And lastly, collaboration and empowerment, a strength-based approach as opposed to a deficit-based approach, allowing for and offering space for voice of all of those involved in choice, realizing that there are multiple remedies and there's restorative practices and that need to have space as well. And overall doing this with and not for people and those involved.
I lastly, oh, sorry, Maureen.
No, go ahead. Yep, I was going to say, moving to you, Aubry. Thank you.
And I just want to summarize our work, at least this very initial pilot work, by saying 3 of our themes built into this general neoliberal rationality of, despite the fact that we are operating in a pandemic and a mental health crisis embedded in that pandemic potentially, that a sense of normalcy and a sense of could be comforting. And so by sharing these kinds of things, resources, the offices are still here. We're engaged with the community to make things better. Look at what all we've accomplished. We're doing the things that a university is good doing outwardly, but we're not necessarily doing the work inwardly within a college and university that might be best suited to the time and the needs of the students. And the only way that we were responding to the pandemic and potentially also mental health needs during that time were through very short declarative alerts, or more in their more expanded form, litanies of things to do. Check in with your advisor, sign up for your classes, make sure you are online. These kinds of to-do list or checkbox-like approach to the response doesn't necessarily offer us much humanity. It was interesting when I registered for this conference with all of us, we all had to confirm our humanity with the CAPTCHA. And I think I would like to have known that the universities and colleges engaged in this study were also confirming theirs as a collective. If you have questions, here are our email addresses. And at this time, I turn it over to discussion. I believe attendees can type in the chat if they have any questions for us. If not, I would ask, do our panelists have any questions for each other as well?
I'd like to comment, it was an excellent presentation, everyone. Very well done.
Stefan, I had a question for you, since I don't see anything popping up. I was interested if you've ever engaged the work of Berlant, in particular, the work on love and desire and its relationship to self and other. While I'm no expert in Lacanian approaches to the self, I thought there might be something there for you.
Yeah, I know of him. I've read one paper that involves some of his work, but I don't know his trajectory or his distinction from Lacan well enough to comment on that. But that's definitely something that now that you've mentioned it, that I will look into.
Yeah, I believe the work that I'm thinking of is love/desire. But I'm also happy to look at it more specifically when we get off this call and send resources and start a conversation.
That'd be great. Yeah, no, that would be excellent. Thank you very much. Oh yeah, okay. Thanks for that, Aubry.
You're more than welcome.
I was actually, come to think of it, I was quite struck by the level of suicidal ideation or reported suicidal ideation. That was quite shocking to me. Did that prompt any kind of response on the behalf of public officials in the area, people who were involved with response team funding, psychologists, this sort of thing, or did it just sort of fall on deaf ears?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this report's been done year after year, I believe for about a decade, if not longer. They have all the reports publicly available going back a decade. And so that number has been slowly creeping up. So I understand seeing that number, right there, it would be shocking, but I think as we were talking about, it's been this slow boiling sort of perpetual crisis. But yes, it has finally gotten to grab the attention of senior administrators. The American Council for Education surveyed college presidents, about 400 of them across the US. And I can find I believe it was 70% said that student mental health and well-being is now mentioned in their strategic plan. 80% had reallocated resources in the last few years. That they were a significant number of institutions were making financial, organizational moves to start to address this crisis, but very little has actually we haven't seen many results on actual campuses. It's a lot of talk, and although it's gotten their attention, I'm not sure they know exactly what to do with it. A lot of them acknowledge that they, while they know that mental health is a serious issue on their crisis, including suicide, they're unsure what exactly to do about it. And I feel like four-year colleges were better equipped and more confident in their ability to address it rather than community colleges, and hence why we focused on that here. So while it's registering, their response really has been fragmented. One of the best responses we've seen thus far, and maybe Maureen can speak to it a little bit more, has been what the state of California is doing with their statewide. They've done a statewide initiative with all of their community colleges. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Maureen, if you don't know it.
That's okay. Yes, they have. They, for whatever reason, they are very focused on it, and they've developed several initiatives, particularly, I think, meeting students where they are in developing online resources and taking a look at involving the students in the process of how to address mental health, whether that's even a shared vocabulary around mental health, that's trying to reduce stigma around mental health, peer networking that seems to be promising for addressing mental health, and understanding the common responses to uncommon circumstances, or I shouldn't say uncommon because it's becoming more common, but adversity that brings about challenges that require extenuating ways in which to deal with them, and having resources that are readily available. But it really does start with the conversation. It starts with the shared language, and it starts with reducing the stigma around mental health. You have to also understand that there's some cultural differences around, we have to all understand there's cultural differences around what needing or having a mental illness has or undertakes within your own culture. And that's an important component, I think, to pay attention to going forward for trauma-informed and resilient approaches. Whether you're from an African-American community or Latinx or Asian, how your culture responds to a mental health crisis may be different, and that's important to incorporate as well. And I think these are particular initiatives around the country, particularly California, that are realizing how important that is. So thank you for that question.
Yeah. I was actually also interested in, in knowing, there's been a lot of awareness that's sort of emerged now about domestic abuse circumstances for a lot of people. And I'm sure the unfortunate few, or the unfortunate whatever number of them within student populations, are also struggling with that. So how is that being addressed? I mean, that's probably a more nuanced sort of situation, because you've got criminality involved, and there's all sorts of issues of this individual's attachment to whoever it is ostensibly abusing. I'm going to say her. So how is that being addressed? Is there any mobilization on that front that is of note? Or
well, if you go ahead, Sarah.
No, go ahead.
Well, if you look at it, sort of, it's hard to, you have your pandemic situation, and then you have your pre-pandemic situation, and it ranges. During the pandemic, I'll put my school teacher hat on for a second. We saw the rates of child abuse reports decrease, and there were some people that were actually sort of, wow, that's interesting, but it wasn't for the reasons why one might expect. It was because the primary reporters of child abuse were those in education, were the teachers and the administrators. And so it's not that anything reduced because people were home and having meals together and things. It was because the reporters were not able to identify and respond accordingly. And so there are these unknown unknowns, you know, we don't know what we don't know that seem to occur in these kinds of situations. Prior to the pandemic, was there any sort of unified approach to domestic violence? No. Was there pocketed or isolated responses? Yes. But it does start with a community effort and involving those people that need to have the voice in the conversation to help put the resources in place for education and reduction of these issues that are going on.
Yeah, I wouldn't have put that together. I mean, the fact of the teacher being the intermediary for the beneficiary for the child who's being, I wouldn't have thought of that or realized it.
Yeah, and you know, no reason to, unless you're sort of right in the muck of it, right? So, but that kind of information, if disseminated, could be really eye-opening, because you can take that and maybe extrapolate to some other ways in which you could view things. You know, it's the meaning we make around the story. I think I'll go back to your presentation. That's very important, and exposing people to a lot of different stories and different narratives is important to expand the way in which we make meaning with the information that we hear. So,
if at this time there are no further questions, I will end our panel today. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to type it into the chat or respond to the emails posted, or to the panelists individually. I'd like to thank